one church, his name is spoken to be cast out. Pastors summon him just to prove they can defeat him publicly on stage in front of a crowd that came to watch. In another house, a few streets away, his name is spoken to invite him in. Someone lights his cigar. Someone pours him a drink. Someone asks him respectfully to open a road that has been closed for years. Same name, same country, same religious family tree, technically, and two completely different beings, depending on which door you walk through. This is Exu. To some, he is the devil himself. The reason certain churches burn down tereros, the reason a single word can get someone attacked in the street. To others, he is the very first spirit you have to greet before anything else in the universe can happen. Not evil, not good, first. So which one is real? Here is the uncomfortable answer. Neither version is a lie, and neither version is the whole truth either. What happened to Exu is not a myth that got confused over time. It is a 500-year-old translation, done by people who never asked what the original word actually meant. Before there was a Brazil to bring him to, Exu already existed in the oral traditions of the Yoruba people in what is now southwestern Nigeria and parts of Benin. And in that original tradition, he is not a villain in anyone's story. He is closer to something like the operating system underneath every other story. Yoruba religion does not work like a single chain of command. There is Olodumare, the supreme force, distant, rarely addressed directly. And there are the orishas, the forces that govern rivers, iron, thunder, love, disease, the hunt. Dozens of them, each with their own domain, their own personality, their own devoted communities. None of them can be reached without going through Exu first. He is the messenger, the one who physically carries prayers upward and carries divine will back down. In some tellings, he is counted as the very first Orisha to set foot on the material world, which is why, to this day, in any ceremony, in any offering, in any ritual, Exu is greeted before anyone else. Not out of fear, out of protocol. Skip him, and the message simply does not arrive. The line stays dead. He is also the guardian of the crossroads, literal roads where paths split, and the symbolic crossroads of every decision a person makes. Every fork in a road, every fork in a life, falls under his watch. And here is the detail almost every outside account leaves out. Exu has no fixed moral alignment, not good, not evil. In the Yoruba worldview, morality is not the axis he operates on at all. He operates on reciprocity. Offer him something, acknowledge him, and the roads open. Ignore him, disrespect the exchange, and the roads close, or worse, they lead somewhere you did not intend to go. There is a myth practitioners still tell to explain why that rule exists. In one version, the other orishas once held a great feast and left Exu off the guest list, assuming a messenger did not need a seat at the table. Exu responded by causing chaos across every one of their domains at once, disrupting harvests, souring rivers, tangling the paths between heaven and earth until the offering ceremony stopped working altogether. The lesson the other orishas learned, and the lesson still repeated in tereros today, is that the messenger cannot be an afterthought. Leave him out, and nothing else functions. Early European missionaries who encountered this figure had a problem. Their own cosmology only had two shelves to put a spirit on: angel or demon. A being this powerful, this unpredictable, standing at the gates between worlds, asking for tribute before letting anything through. To eyes trained on a very different story, that silhouette looked disturbingly familiar. They had not met a monster yet. They had just run out of the right word. Exu did not travel to Brazil. He was dragged there, inside the memory of people who had everything else taken from them. Starting in the 16th century, The transatlantic slave trade forced millions of West and Central Africans across the ocean. Brazil received more enslaved people than any other single destination in the Americas, and that history is precisely why its African-derived religions grew as deep and as varied as they did. Among the people forced across that ocean were Yoruba people carrying Exu, Ogun, Yemanya, Zango, and Bantu-speaking peoples from Central Africa, carrying their own spiritual systems, their own ancestral frameworks. Enslavement was designed to erase exactly this kind of memory. Different ethnic groups were deliberately mixed together on plantations, partly to prevent communication and partly to prevent exactly what ended up happening anyway. People from different nations, different languages, different original religions, finding common ground in the one thing that could not be physically confiscated, what they carried inside their heads. In Bahia, in Rio de Janeiro, in the port cities where enslaved Africans were concentrated, something remarkable happened under enormous pressure. Traditions that had been separate for centuries in Africa, Yoruba, Fon, Bantu, began merging into new, distinctly Brazilian religious systems. Candomblé took shape this way. Not a single African religion transplanted intact, but a reconstruction, built from fragments of several, adapted to a completely new and hostile environment. And Exu came through that process largely intact in function, even as his name multiplied. Depending on the region, the nation of origin, the specific terreiro, he might be called Exu, or Bara, or Eligbara. Regional variations on the same underlying role. The one who opens the way, the one greeted first, the one who must be acknowledged before any other spirit is called. Practicing this openly was not safe. Colonial law and the Catholic Church treated African spiritual practice as, at best, superstition to be stamped out, and at worst, as literal communion with the devil. So Candomblé did what persecuted religions have done throughout history. It survived by wearing a mask. Orishas were paired publicly with Catholic saints, not because practitioners confused the two, but because a shrine to a saint was legal and a shrine to an African god was not. Behind the image of the saint, the original devotion continued. Exu's mask, though, would turn out to be the most complicated one to wear, because the saint the colonizers eventually reached for was not a saint at all. Here is where the story turns. When Portuguese missionaries and colonial authorities first encountered Exu, they were not looking at him with curiosity. They were looking for heresy to correct. And their own religious framework gave them exactly one available slot for a spirit this powerful, this morally ambiguous, standing at the threshold between the human world and the divine one, the devil. It is worth being precise about what happened here, because it is not really a misunderstanding in the innocent sense. The concept of a single embodiment of evil, a fallen angel ruling over hell, does not exist anywhere in Yoruba cosmology. There is no Yoruba word that means devil the way Christianity means it. Missionaries did not discover that Exu was secretly evil. They did not have a category for an amoral messenger spirit who demands reciprocity, so they filed him under the closest thing they did have. And once a religion is criminalized, that misreading stops being academic. It becomes policy. Colonial authorities restricted African religious practice for centuries, treating drumming, offerings, and possession trance as evidence of sorcery rather than worship, and practicing Candomblé openly could carry real punishment, from raided ceremonies to confiscated ritual objects to arrest. So orishas were hidden behind the faces of Catholic saints, a strategy that let devotion continue in plain sight. But Exu's syncretism carried an extra layer of danger that other orishas did not have to deal with. Depending on the terreiro, the region, the specific quality or path of Exu being honored, he might be paired with Saint Anthony of Padua, the finder of lost things, a fitting match for a spirit who reopens blocked roads. In other traditions, particularly around figures like Bara, the pairing shifts to Saint Peter, the apostle holding the literal keys to heaven's gate. Two saints, both gatekeepers, both associated with thresholds and access, which tells you the underlying logic was not random. Practitioners were not hiding a devil behind a saint. They were matching function to function, gatekeeper to gatekeeper, key holder to key holder. None of that nuance survived outside the terreiro walls. What survived, in the wider Brazilian imagination, was simpler and far more damaging. Exu equals devil, full stop. A 5th-century game of telephone, played by people with the power to make their version the official one. This is the part that trips up almost everyone outside these traditions, including plenty of Brazilians who have grown up hearing the name without ever setting foot in a terreiro. Exu does not point to one fixed thing. It changes meaning depending on which religion is doing the pointing. In Candomblé, Exu is exactly what we described earlier. An Orisha, a divine force, worshipped, honored first in every ceremony, tied directly back to the original Yoruba cosmology with comparatively little alteration. In Umbanda, a religion that itself only formed in Brazil in the early 20th century, most commonly traced to a series of spiritual sessions held near Rio de Janeiro in 1908, blending Afro-Brazilian traditions with Spiritism, Catholicism, and indigenous elements, Exu is not treated as an Orisha at all. He becomes what is called an egum, the spirit of someone who once lived and died. Specifically, Umbanda tradition frames its Exus as the spirits of people who were marginalized in life. The enslaved, the poor, the outcast, figures society pushed to its edges. In the terminology of the tradition, they work the left line, and in most Umbanda houses, they operate under the guidance of caboclos and pretos velhos, spirit guides who, in this hierarchy, are considered the senior presence in the house. In Quimbanda, the structure flips again. There are no orishas here at all. Quimbanda does not organize itself around Candomblé's pantheon. Instead, the Exus and their female counterparts, the Pombagiras, are the center of the religion, not guests operating under someone else's authority. They are approached directly, for justice, for opening paths, for confronting the parts of a person's life kept in shadow. Same word, 3 different theological architectures. And this is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened into one image the moment it crosses into pop culture, or worse, into a pulpit looking for a villain. Strip away the mislabeling, and what is left is a role that is remarkably consistent across all 3 traditions. Exu manages the boundary. At the start of a ceremony, whether in a Candomblé terreiro, an Umbanda center, or a Quimbanda house, the way between the material world and the spiritual one has to be opened before anything else can happen. That opening is Exu's job. At the end of the ceremony, that same doorway has to be closed again, cleanly, so nothing is left hanging between worlds. That closing is also his job. Part of that responsibility extends into darker territory, reaching into what practitioners call the umbral, the denser, heavier layers of the spirit world, where confused or suffering spirits can become trapped. Exu's ability to move freely across boundaries makes him one of the few forces capable of navigating that territory to guide lost souls back toward the light. It is protective work, even when it looks unsettling from the outside. There is an old story told in these traditions that captures his nature better than any definition could. Exu once walked down a road between two farms, wearing a hat that was painted a different color on each side. Red on the left, black on the right. The two farmers, lifelong friends, spent the rest of the day arguing about what color the stranger's hat had been, each one certain, each one accusing the other of lying. By the time Exu returned to reveal the trick, the friendship was already in pieces. The lesson practitioners draw from it is not that Exu is cruel. It is that he exposes how much of human conflict comes from mistaking your own point of view for the whole truth. That reciprocal relationship is also why physical crossroads still matter in practice today. It is common in cities across Brazil to find small offerings left at street corners late at night. Candles, cigars, a small plate of food. To an outsider walking past, it can look strange, even alarming. Inside the tradition, it is simply a despacho, a payment left exactly where Exu does his work, a way of keeping the relationship in good standing so the roads stay open for the person who left it. And then there is the part of Exu that makes churches uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. The offerings, cigars, cachaça. In Christian moral language, tobacco and alcohol read as vice, as temptation, sometimes as sin itself. In this framework, they are not moral failures being indulged. They are tools, offerings that acknowledge Exu's nature and keep the reciprocal relationship in balance. He is not being tempted, he is being paid. That is really the through line of everything Exu represents. A being operating entirely outside the good versus evil axis that so much of Western religion is built on. Not a saint, not a devil, a trickster, unpredictable by design, who keeps every door, literal and spiritual, functioning the way it is supposed to. Here is where this stops being a story about the distant past. The demonization that started with colonial missionaries did not stay in the colonial era. In the mid-20th century, a Catholic friar published a book aimed squarely at Umbanda, using Exu as the centerpiece example of what he called a demonic cult. A few years later, the Second Vatican Council pushed the Catholic Church toward a more ecumenical stance, and that particular strain of institutional persecution largely faded. It did not disappear, it relocated. Starting in the 1970s, a wave of neo-Pentecostal churches began expanding rapidly across Brazil, and many built a significant part of their public identity around opposing Afro-Brazilian religions specifically. Exu became the preferred target, publicly exercised in services, invoked by name specifically, so a pastor could be seen defeating him in front of a congregation. It is a strategy that treats an entire religious tradition as a prop for someone else's performance of spiritual authority. The real-world cost of that performance is not abstract. Terreiros have been vandalized and set on fire. Practitioners have been physically attacked, verbally harassed, pushed out of neighborhoods. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the phrase Exu Corona spread in parts of Brazil. Exu's name deliberately fused with the virus, turning a centuries-old religious figure into shorthand for disease and death in the public imagination. In a country where Afro-Brazilian religious communities were already reporting rising incidents of religious intolerance. Researchers studying this pattern describe Exu functioning in Brazilian society almost like a scapegoat in the original sense of the word, a figure onto which a society projects what it considers unacceptable, then attacks the projection instead of examining itself. And this is happening to a religious community that is far from marginal in size. Candomblé and Umbanda together are practiced across every region of Brazil, in cities and in small towns, by people from every social class. Even as official census numbers likely undercount them, since generations of stigma have taught many practitioners to describe their faith more quietly, or to list themselves under a different religion entirely on paper. The demonization did not just distort a myth, it taught an entire population to hide. So, back to the two rooms from the beginning of this video. The pastor casting him out on a stage, and the practitioner lighting his cigar with quiet respect a few streets away, are not disagreeing about facts. They inherited two completely different translations of the same original figure. One shaped by a 500-year-old colonial mistranslation that hardened into doctrine. The other preserved, against enormous pressure, by the very communities that never stopped knowing what he actually was. It is worth remembering that this pattern is not unique to Brazil or to this one figure. Every time one culture's spiritual system gets filtered through another culture's moral categories, something gets lost in the gap between the two languages, and whatever gets lost tends to get replaced with whichever story is easiest to fear. Exu is simply one of the clearest examples still visible today, because the tradition that remembers the original meaning never went extinct. It kept practicing, kept passing the knowledge down, kept insisting on the truth even while being punished for it. Exu was never the devil. He was never purely benevolent either. He was, and still is, something Western religious categories were never built to hold. A force that belongs to neither side of that line, standing exactly where he has always stood, at the crossroads, deciding what gets to pass through. The uncomfortable question worth sitting with is this one. How many other figures, across how many other erased traditions, are still wearing a mask that was never theirs to begin with? That is where we are headed next. Subscribe to Temple of Mysteries, because almost every civilization we are about to uncover has a figure just like this one, waiting for someone to finally ask what they were called before the mistranslation.